Mr. Geard repeated his effort, but being not much more skillful at these maneuvers than young Private Thompson, there was no small danger of his falling head front into the water between the boat and the barge. Sam, however, caught at his oar blade and flung him back. He collapsed across the seat of his tiny skiff, but the little tub righted itself and all was well. "Looky here, Mr. Mayor, what my father insisted on putting in." Taking advantage of Matt Decker's lifting one of the old men out and wading with him through the water, Sam stooped down in the stern of the barge and lifted up a rabbit hutch. "3 top beers and 1 little black one," he shouted above the uproar. "The vicarage, you know, is high and dry, and I think Miss Drew's all right, though her servant got panicky. I saw them perched on that drive gate calling out to every boat that passed. But they'll have to hang on to this hutch till father goes home. We found it in the water near Buckwire Hut, where Abel Twig lives. We couldn't see anything of the old man. We punted far out of their way till we were quite close to his place. But nothing except the chimneys could we see. It's so near the river. The water's terribly deep there. All you can see are a few mounds, the ancient British mounds." All these remarks Sam shouted to Mr. Geard as the current of the flood swept between them and carried the latter's little boat away. Bloody Johnny nodded farewell to him as he took his oars firmly in his hands and set himself to row in the direction of those ancient British mounds. He rowed directly towards the river, which he realized he could easily follow by reason of its swifter current, and which he knew, after it had skirted Beckery and Paradise, would lead him near Lake Village Field. What Sam had said about Abel Twig's rabbit hutch and about the old man's chimneys being all that was visible had been accepted by Bloody Johnny as an omen sent by his master. "Rescue Abel Twig," he muttered to himself. "Rescue Abel Twig." He was now resolutely set upon dying before night fell. He did not think of this as suicide. The thought of suicide never once crossed even that nimbus of feeling which connects the double horns of the mind, like the old moon within the crescent of the new moon. Mr. Geard had the peculiarity of believing absolutely and without question in the existence of the next world. He also knew for certain, by the evidence of personal experience, that a living being, who might or might not be the Christ the churches worshipped, awaited his presence in what he called the next dream. Mr. Geard had been made to understand by the mediumship of the being that conditions of life after the death of the body were immeasurably superior to those now existing. He had also been promised that this being would meet him face to face and would satisfy to the full the accumulated erotic desires, at once mystical and sensual, which were the master cravings of his nature. Not long after Mr. Geard's death, for he does die, not long after the sifting out of all these dramatic events, one of the cleverest women psychologists of our time brought forward an interpretation of the man's mood on this fatal day that deserves to be recorded. May I just stop here for a second? So, a couple months ago, I was just looking up Glastonbury romance stuff, online as you do, looking up some criticism. And I read a post somewhere, I forget where exactly, maybe next time I'll say it, and this asshole in it said how, spoiler alert, Mr. Geard drowns. He just kind of threw that in there, in this essay about Powys in the New York Times or the New York Review of Books. And I gotta say, what a fucking asshole. This book's 1,200 pages long. Maybe somebody who's reading that thing who's going to want to read it someday. Maybe not. Maybe somebody who's reading it might be browsing the internet. And he just fucking throw that in there a spoiler alert that happens literally in the last 20 pages of the fucking 1,200-page book, you motherfucker. And when I find her name, I'm going to post it on here. I forget it already. You jackass. So anyway, that pissed me off a little bit. Ba-ba-ba-ba. According to this view of his feelings during the last hours of his life, the stress ought to be laid upon the curious pathological necessity, under which he was known to labor, of actually sharing with all his bodily nerves this physical suffering of those around him. This authority hesitated not to point out that in the cause of Titty, and in the case of the idiot boy outside the Pilgrimses, and in the case of Owen Evans in the hospital, the man had been seen to display actual physical signs of suffering exactly parallel to those endured by Mrs. Petherton, and by the boy, and by Mr. Evans as he told his stupendous story. The amazing, but surely not impossible explanation, offered by the penetrating woman, is that a violent psychic radiation from all the minds of the 27 people, including children, who were actually drowned during these 12 ghastly hours, riddled Mr. Geard's hypersensitized and superporous sympathy with what might be called the drowning spasm, and produced in him a craving for death by drowning that really amounted to a kind of drowning hypnosis. This brilliant writer points out further, in regards to the mystery of the death of Geard of Glastonbury, that his growing preoccupation with the Grail fount on Chalice Hill was itself a hydrophiliastic obsession. While many pathological subjects, this writer maintains, seek a prenatal peace in death, what Mr. Geard in his planetary consciousness desired was a return to that remote and primal element of water, which was literally the great maternal womb of all organic earth life. Makes sense. That's what happened to Spalding Gray, right? It was this woman's far-fetched pamphlet that, with its use of pathological technical terms, had such a large share in turning the attention of intellectual people away from the religious aspects of the problem. What Blarney Johnny was really struggling with, however, as he splashed along in his frail tub, past the outskirts of Beckery and of Paradise till he reached the swirling currents of the flood-swamped river, was his love for Morgan and Megan and Crummy. Of Cordelia he hardly thought of all, though it must be confessed that a faint and clinging sweetness, like a fragrance within a fragrance, drew his mind now and then towards the figure of Lady Rachel. It was painful to him to condemn his wife and daughter, left up there at Whirl Hill in that strange camp tent, to what he knew well enough would be a pitiful if not a rending shock. Over and over again he placed the alternatives before himself, to go on with his life and spare them this blow, or to follow the devouring death-lust which had gathered upon him and ruthlessly plunged them into this human loss. He was in the river current now, flowing westward in furious, angry eddies, which the incoming sea tide forced back upon themselves. In spite of the roll of the great flood eastward, as soon as he reached the center of the river, the current swept him westward, rocking his tiny skiff in the most threatening manner, and rendering it totally unnecessary for a while, even to attempt to use his oars. So he just pulled them in and let them lie across the little boat in front of his big stomach. Mr. Geard's character will never be understood, or the monstrous inhumanity of his departure from the visible world condoned, until it is realized that the unruffled amiability and the unfailing indulgence of his attitude to those near and dear to him concealed a hidden detachment from them that had always been an unbridged gulf. The mass and volume of his being was composed of a weight of cold phlegmatic substance that was always sinking down by a weird gravitational pull to a species of preorganic cosmic inertia. His great moments came when this heavy inertness, pulling him down into the silt and slime of the chemical basis of life, was roused to activity by his erotic mysticism. For the truth is that the psychic, sensual life-lust in Mr. Garrett was always being lulled to dormant quiescence under the weight of his sluggish physical nature. The spirit within him needed to be roused and stirred up before it could feel really alive by some super formidable and super dramatic quest. Such a quest had been his passion for the Grail fount, till that Welshman's question about Arthur had confused his mind. But he was weary of all that now, and if his nature was not to sink back into the heavier elements of sluggish neutral indifference, he must get into closer contact with his invisible master than was possible in that muddy vesture of earth life. He was muttering to himself now, as his little boat began whirling round and round in one of those dangerous confluences where the salt flood met the river's current. Ha! The ocean smell was in his nostrils, and there in the water, whirling around with his cockle-shell boat, was a piece of authentic white seaweed. He stretched out one of his plump hands, his left hand it was, to clutch this bit of seaweed, his mind racing back to old childish days on Weymouth Beach. This would have been the end of him, for the water was very deep here, and Mr. Garrett had never learned to swim. But at that moment he began this stretching gesture, which, carried an inch further, would have upset his boat. The river current defeated the sea flood and swept him on out of the dangerous circle of that vortex and carried him forward with increasing rapidity towards Lake Village Great Field. He had lost the white seaweed, but he had escaped being drowned by an accident. But what was this? Something vast and glittering swept into view in the very midst of the river. A portion of Philip's new bridge, torn from its shaft holes in this mud banks, and dragged, steel and scaffolding and crossbeams and all, into the center of the torrent, this towering symbol of the power of capital, of the power of science, was now the sport of what looked like mocking, mischievous, taunting cuckoo spit out of chaos itself. Mr. Garrett neither smiled nor chuckled nor congratulated himself at this surprising sight. He just surveyed it with a lively, objective, inquisitive interest. An interest worthy of Bert Cole or of Timothy Wallop. But the apparition of this costly piece of wreckage served to divert the drifting of the boat that carried him, sweeping it, as the two objects collided, across the submerged northern bank of the Brood towards the middle of Lake Village Field. Here the water was a little shallower, but still quite deep enough to drown a man whose height was not over 6 feet, and in special hollows on the edge of the mouths much deeper than that. Mr. Garrett now reclaimed possession of his oars, thrusting them into the row locks and pulling energetically towards all he could see of the dwelling of Abel Twig. Yes, Sam Dacker was right. There was not much else than the chimney of Backware Hut, together with a small fragment of its roof, visible across the surface of a mud-colored lake, above which its brickwork showed almost black. But several of the bigger mounds of the old lake village were still visible, their round tops protruding from the waste of waters like diseased excrescences on the wrinkled surface of a vast brown leaf. But Mr. Garrett found himself confronted now by several objects more exciting to a human brain lodged in a wooden tub on a brown flood than mere chimney tops. He became aware that upon the largest of these lake village mounds there were living figures, consisting, as far as he could make out, of a man, a child, and an animal, among whom the man and the child were desperately summoning him to their aid. There was something floating in the water, too, with a dark object clinging to it that was also waving to him. So detached was the man's mind at this juncture, with his own life and death held in the balance, that he found himself in the coolest and calmest fashion comparing the scene before him with an old Bible picture of the flood, which used to obsess his mind as a little boy at Town's End in Montacute. Here again, the difference between water and fire rose up and manifested itself. Had the element that threatened the lives of all these living creatures been fire, there would have been such an automatic beat of panic fear in his pulses that such mental detachment as he now felt would have been impossible. Well, let's see here. I think tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, if you're around, I'm going to read the rest of this book live on YouTube. Because we're very near the end now. And I might as well just get it over with. Pull that Band-Aid off. Get your flu shots, by the way. And this Glastonbury, this penultimate edition. Actually, there's going to be one after I finish it up. I'm going to recap on Thursday. But anyway, this episode is brought to you by Universal Studios Hollywood and Angela. Thank you, Angela, for this fine mug you gave me. Or left in a thrift store that I took. Anyway, Wednesday will be the final reading of Glastonbury. 8 p.m. live, I'm hoping. YouTube. Eastern Standard Time. And then on Thursday, we'll have a little recap where I'll just go over my feelings and long, strange trip it's been, hasn't it? And then on Friday, I'll start the next book, which I'll tell you about on Thursday, I guess. Till next time, though, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.